the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Hey, welcome, Housers, to another episode of On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door, my organization located north of Toronto and in the GTA, and our good friends at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They are doing exceptional work. If you want to become a Built for Zero community, and let me tell you, you do, check out their website at caeh.ca, and as well all the different amazing things they're doing. They quite often, when budgets, either provincial or federal, usually federal, are being brought forward, they rally around people and have different things. This time it was a housing prevention benefit that they're pushing hard on. And then you could get on board to support that and get your community and everyone. So check out their website at cah.ca to see all the wonderful things that the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness is doing, because I am just scratching the surface. Meanwhile, at Blue Door, great things happening, as always, with a tremendous team there. We continue to work on scaling our construction social enterprise construct to have a greater impact, perhaps across Ontario, perhaps across the country, and maybe perhaps south of the border at some point, because, hey, it works. It prevents people from entering into homelessness, because we need thousands of people in the trades to build the millions of homes we need across the country. And tradespeople are retiring at a rapid rate. People need jobs with a meaningful wage that are meaningful. So it should be a living wage and meaningful work. And that's what we do with the Construct program. Plus, guess what? Hey, we are doing construction projects, so it brings in revenue to Blue Door, not on the backs of government, right? So we're getting it done. We are part of the solution, the good folks at Blue Door. But let's get to today's guest. He has come on the podcast a couple times before, I believe. This time is his first time solo. And we're going to talk a little bit about the National Housing Strategy. This is a strategy that was the first ever by the federal government getting back into the housing game in 2017. It was exciting. It was launched with great enthusiasm. Everyone in the sector was super excited. Now it's 6 years later. Where is it at? Is it working? Does it need a reset? Our guest today, Jacob Gorenkoff, is going to talk a little bit about that, because he recently wrote an article saying it needs a reset. And we want to find out why he's saying that and what the suggestions are. Jake, welcome to the show.
A member of the bald community, Mike.
You're getting there. You're getting there. There's still a little dusting on top, but good work on the beard.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Jacob, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. I love chatting with you about this stuff, and you're doing wonderful work at CHRA. The first question we always ask, and you're getting a couple opportunities to get it right, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Thanks for the question, Mike. And it's a great one, honestly. I think oftentimes when we think about home, we think about four walls and a roof. But at the same time, home is so much more than that. It's about community. It's about feeling connected to the area that we're living in, connected to the people that are around us. And I think we realize that's especially true in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we couldn't go out for a lot of it. But I think what we're also seeing now with so many people feeling the affordability crunch is that home is also about affordability. There is a majority of people, I think at this point, according to recent public opinion polls, that say that housing affordability is one of their top concerns. And it's something that's especially true for the people that we work with who are in need of affordable housing.
Yeah, it's so true. I think people think of the physical structure, but instead, what housing usually means to people is what that physical structure brings you. You talk about the comfort, community, safety, well-being, and that kind of stuff. Interesting enough, in Toronto, there is a new race to become mayor, and they're saying one of the big pieces that people are thinking about, of course, is housing and affordability. I think only 47%, which they said was high, said we think there's not enough housing in Toronto, which I thought was pretty low, because I would think that almost everyone would think that, but 47%, apparently it was quite high. And then when they flipped it over, the sad part about that was 74% said, yeah, we need more affordable housing, just not near me. So NIMBYism is alive and well, sadly. And listen, here's newsflash for all of those people, and it has to be near you. It is for you. It is part of your community, for people in your community. This has got to happen. So if we're going to build affordable housing, it's got to be mixed in everywhere, and that is the best possible model. Listen, before we get going and talk about you and all the good stuff that is happening, or sorry, before we talk about CHRA, let's talk about you. Let's talk about your journey into this sector. If you could give us the high points, tell us a little bit about yourself, Jacob.
Okay, I'll try not to ramble too much. I think, like a lot of people, I basically fell into working in this sector. When I was in school, I discovered how much I loved advocacy. And eventually I decided the best place for me to go to pursue a career in advocacy was Ottawa. I did my master's in political management at Carleton, learned about the elements that actually go into making an effective advocate. And I got my first job out of my master's lobbying for the Canadian Real Estate Association, mostly about home ownership. And it was a great sort of introduction to learning about both like housing policy and advocacy. But I got to the point where I realized that there's this whole section of the housing spectrum where there's so much more work that could be done, where I could have a real impact. And so I found out about a job with the Canadian Housing Renewal Association about, I think about 3 years ago now. Time's really flown with COVID. And I started off as basically as a jack of all trades, helping out wherever I could. But more recently, over the last, I think maybe 8 months, again, time is flying, I've been focusing entirely on policy and advocacy, trying to get things into the budget, trying to make sure that we actually have an affordable housing sector equipped with what we need to make sure that people can be adequately housed.
Well, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about CHRA. There's how many members and how does it work and what's the purpose? You've been through a leadership change. You've got a new ED. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So for people that don't know, CHRA, the Canadian Housing Renewal Association, is the national organization representing the affordable housing sector. Our members they come from all sorts of backgrounds. We have municipalities, provincial and territorial housing departments, affordable housing providers, service providers, construction companies, individuals that are interested in dealing with the housing crisis. And collectively, all of them house, shelter, and support hundreds of thousands of people across the country. And they also provide other services to people that are experiencing housing precarity and homelessness too. A lot of the work that we do is related to two things. One being providing capacity building programs and services like the programs offered through the Chartered Institute of Housing, or the Housing Professionals Mentorship Program, which, Mike, you've been a mentor in before, and now I'm a mentor in, which is a lot of fun. But we also exist, and like the reason why we exist, why we were created back in 1968, was to advocate on behalf of the sector with the federal government. What's new and exciting, Mike, you mentioned that we've had a change in leadership. So now we have this fantastic fellow named Ray Sullivan, who's our executive director. He joined us back in July, I believe. And for those of you that don't know Ray, you should, because he's fantastic and I love him. And that's not just because I want to raise, but it's because he really is. He's an incredible leader. He knows his stuff as it relates to affordable housing. And Mike, as you and I would appreciate, he can crack a very, very good cringeworthy dad joke. It's fantastic. But under Ray's leadership, we've really embarked upon a huge revamp of our advocacy efforts. Over the last 6 months or so, we've taken half as many meetings with designated public office holders as we had in the previous 13 years of lobbying. So that just goes to show how much work is happening as it relates to advocacy with the federal government. And relatedly, we're starting to get a lot of media attention, and we're getting a lot of opportunities to demonstrate our thought leadership with the federal government and begin making more things happen to address Canada's housing issues.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And you're absolutely, CHRA provides that kind of one voice. You gather all the input from your members and what you're hearing across the country. You kind of put it together and make sure that it's going in the ear of government. And we so appreciate that. You're doing a great job. Just recently, as we record this, today it's March 31st, as we record this, it won't come out on March 31st, but the budget this week, federal budget, was passed. You and I talked. Fairly disappointing on the housing end of things. Let's talk a little bit, if you're comfortable, like what we'd hoped for, what didn't happen. We know even with the Ontario budget that was passed, I think a week before, there was some housing news out of there, or around the homelessness portfolio. They put millions more forward. Federally, not so much. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a very disappointing budget for housing. We were given signals that there would be a lot more in there for us. Obviously, like we were also told that it was a time of fiscal restraint and that we should measure or like temper our expectations. But two of the things that we advocated for very, very strongly, one being funding for an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy to be delivered by an Indigenous-led housing center. We working off of the National Housing Council's recommendation that there needed to be $56 billion over 10 years to meet the needs of Indigenous peoples living in urban, rural, and northern areas off reserve. We were disappointed that we only got $4 billion over 7 years, and that funding is only going to begin to roll out in the next fiscal year. So it's kind of just, it's not reflective of the need. And that money, according to the budget backgrounder, is also going to be given to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation instead of noting that it would be given to an Indigenous-led organization. So that's something that was disappointing that we want to make sure that we continue to follow up on. Another thing of great importance to us was related to an injection of additional funds in the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. The Co-Investment Fund is the flagship program to create affordable housing through the National Housing Strategy. And from working with CMHC and doing our own calculations, we determined that the program needed an injection of $4 billion per year in order to continue to create housing at the level that we saw before rising interest rates and inflation and construction costs going up. And instead of that, even though we were given signals that there would be something in there, not the full amount that we asked for, but something, we ended up being given a promise to repurpose funds from the repair stream of co-investment into the new construction stream, which isn't exactly the most sensible considering that CMHC reported that almost 40% of affordable housing units are in need of repair right now. So the fact that there is money in that pot just means that people can't access that money. It's not because there's no need. Relatedly, we were also hoping for funding for a property acquisition program to basically support nonprofits, co-ops, and municipalities to compete in the private market and acquire existing rental properties so that they can ensure that they remain affordable in perpetuity. And related to all of that, we recognize that we're in a context right now where a lot has changed. Inflation has gone up, interest rates have gone up significantly over the last year, like really 9 months, and construction costs have gone up a lot. So a lot of national housing strategy programs that may have worked back in 2017 when the strategy was created don't necessarily work anymore. And we need a commitment to revisiting them so that we can continue to meet the needs of Canadians that need affordable housing.
Yeah, it's you talk about shuffling money around at CMHC, who's a partner quite often in this podcast, but part of the challenge always even with new money coming in is access to it, right? And there are some pieces where the access is so tough to get at for pots of innovation money, say, or rent to own. It's not being spent. They're not getting projects coming forward because they just can't match up, right? But the need is definitely there. I've heard 15 to 1, 13 to 1 for every new build. We lose 15 to the private market, crumbling infrastructure, or 13 or 7. I mean, we're definitely losing more to crumbling infrastructure and privatization, where they come in to buy up affordable housing is no longer affordable, than to new builds. So it was disappointing, yet we push on. And your work continues, and we're fortunate to have you leading some of that work and continuing to be the voice that will not just go away. Now, speaking of having a voice, you recently penned an article. I'm going to read it here. Canada's national housing strategy needs a reset. And that's what we want to talk about today in greater depth. Before diving in too far, and for those who don't know, can you just shape up give kind of broad strokes of the national housing strategy's beginnings and the idea behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Housing Strategy was created in 2017 out of a realization that Canada's housing supply of all types, especially affordable rental, wasn't keeping pace with demand. We were experiencing increasing incidents of homelessness and poor housing need that required major policy intervention from the federal government. And to credit the Liberals, who are currently still in government, they intervened in affordable housing policy after decades of relative inaction from both Liberals and Conservatives before them. So kudos to them. But today, the National Housing Strategy, which is $89 billion, or I should say valued at $89 billion, which is supposed to run until 2028, there are things that could be tweaked, could be revamped. And we want to work with them to make that happen.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Even when they launched the National Housing Strategy, I remember, and tons of respect for Adam Vaughan, who was the driver behind that when he was the parliamentary secretary. A lot of it was kind of back end loaded, right? Like for the first few years, and it built on, and also it built on time when the Liberals may not be in power, right? If it goes to 2028, right now it seems that they may be able to hold on to that until 2025, pending their agreement with the NDP. But beyond that, we're unsure. But let's talk about the National Housing Strategy. I'd say some of the things that they could point to that have been semi-successful are really the Rapid Housing Initiative, where they've seen a lot of housing come out of that. And I think we're just on round 3 now. But the challenges since they've launched this have really grown. We've actually seen the number of people experiencing affordability issues and homelessness grow. So, people looking at this, or opposition might say, this isn't working. And you might tend to agree. What are some of the pieces you think are working well and that we could point to say, let's build on this? And what are some of the pieces that absolutely need a kind of rethink?
Yeah, you know what? Rather than starting with the things that I think are working well, I think we should talk about why things are moving so slowly. And like a lot of the time when we talk about creating housing in Canada, we talk about the delays that we experience. There are tons of them, right? When we think at the local level, we think about issues with zoning and permitting, but there are also bureaucratic hoops at the federal level too. So we've seen over the last couple of years, especially the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the Office of the Auditor General, both are independent officers of Parliament with mandates to table reports analyzing different federal programs. They've both indicated that a big problem with the National Housing Strategy is the implementation delays that are being experienced with most programs, especially like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative and the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. Because of the way these programs are structured, the money is just not being rolled out quickly enough. And it's a big problem, obviously, because we're not creating the housing that we need nearly as quickly as we should be. And I think like we also need to think about the sheer size of the crisis. Programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative that got money out the door quickly were great, and we need to try to replicate them and learn from that experience with that program as much as we can. But when we think about the crisis and the size of it, like $89 billion in the National Housing Strategy is actually not going to get us that far. There was a June 2022 report from CMHC that said that we need to build 3.5 million housing units above and beyond what is going to be created through the National Housing Strategy. And by the time that publication was put online back in June 2022, that research wasn't indicative of rising inflation that we've experienced since, or interest rates going up, or construction costs going up, where we've actually had the Parliamentary Budget Officer say that federal spending power to create housing has gone down significantly because of those things. So just because of those factors, that 3.5 million units above and beyond what's going to be created through the National Housing Strategy has undoubtedly grown. And then you also factor in the fact that the federal government is going to bring in more immigrants than expected as well. We're going to need to find places to put them. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't bring in immigrants. I think we should, because we need them. But we also need to be able to house them, and we need to be able to house the people that are in Canada already too. And so we're looking at this situation where it needs to be all hands on deck, because like that 3.5 million units above and beyond what the National Housing Strategy is going to fund is probably more like 5 million now with all these new changes. So what's worked? Rapid Housing Initiative, which is like the main example. Let's find ways to do things like that more, and try to get rid of these implementation barriers as fast as possible. Otherwise, we have no chance of meeting these housing shortfalls and restoring affordability.
Yeah, well put. I know even from Blue Door, we've been trying to work through a property that we have, and the co-investment just won't work. Not to have deeply affordable. And now let's remind people too that CMHC's definition, or federal government definition of affordable, I think it's 80% of mid-market rent, which is truly unaffordable to most of, at least our clients and many people, right? So when we look at like truly affordable, it's really hard. And what's happened with those rising co-investment, there'll be some grant money, but also there'll be some, they'll arrange a bit of a loan. And as you spoke to, rising interest rates, then those loan costs go up, construction costs go up. Instead of building 40 units, now maybe you can only do 25, and that might throw everything off. So it's really put us all into a tailspin. So if you were working with the government right now and they were saying, Jake, tell us what needs to happen to turn this around, what are some of the things that you would suggest to them with this reset?
I think where I would start is with what's already there. And that's thinking about the flagship program to create affordable housing, which is the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. There have always been problems with it. Not to say that it was a bad program from the outset, but like anything, it could have been improved long ago, and they've tried to do that. In the last couple of years alone, there have been literally hundreds of tweaks to that program to try to make it more user-friendly so that the funds were easier to access. Has that been the case? I'm not sure. I've never actually had to navigate the program. I'm just aware of the broad strokes and the macro level policy and advocacy around it. But with co-investment too, if we're thinking about this changing context, the original intent of the program, which was to renew or create affordable housing, to reduce homelessness and core housing need, it was designed at a time of historically low interest rates back in 2017. But now we need to acknowledge that the economic context has shifted considerably. We've been through a global pandemic. Like we were talking about, inflation, interest rates, construction costs, they've all gone up. And we need to change to adapt to that context. And Mike, we've talked about this before, and I know like you've experienced similar things through, or you've experienced this with Blue Door. In that, like, interest rates rose so quickly back in 2022, in that latter half of the year. Because of that and other increased costs related to construction and labor and things like that, it meant that projects that were no longer viable even a couple months earlier, that were viable a couple months earlier, were no longer viable after that. They just weren't penciling out anymore because of those changes. So what ended up happening was that a lot of the projects that were already in the co-investment pipeline were in danger of falling through. And a lot of the nonprofits that had already committed considerable money to getting ready to do these projects could have been in a lot of danger of falling apart if CMHC didn't rescue them by adding additional grant dollars for them to those projects. So that's what CMHC did. They allocated additional grant dollars to those projects at the time. And it was the right call, because you needed to make sure that those projects didn't fall through, because if they did, we would have been in an even worse situation after. But the consequence of that is that the co-investment fund's grant budget has been significantly diminished. And we have to keep in mind that it's 2023, like we're at the end of the first quarter of 2023, and the National Housing Strategy is supposed to last until 2028. So we have 5 years to go. and the grant budget is largely diminished. So to make the remaining funds last, because they need to do something for the next 5 years, CMHC ended up capping the grant contributions at $25,000 per unit, which was dropped from 40% of total project cost. So in some cases, that's a drop of about $175,000 in grants per unit. So that alone makes you think that like you won't be able to have a project that pencils out. And another interesting thing to note, there are some projects in the city of Toronto that are getting more than triple the amount of maximum grant funding from the city compared to what they can get from CMHC now, which is kind of backwards considering the difference in fiscal capacity that the city has versus the federal government has. Like the federal government has so much more money than cities do. But all that to say, a lot of projects have multi-million-dollar funding gaps right now, which means that you literally can't use the co-investment fund to create affordable housing anymore, which is obviously a huge problem, especially when you consider that we need to more than double the stock of affordable housing just to be in line with the OECD average. It's not a good situation. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, CHRA advocated for an injection of $4 billion per year into the program. We've lobbied quite hard for it, and we were very genuinely shocked and dismayed that there was no new money for the program. All that to say, though, we're going to continue to push for more money and continue to push for additional changes to the national housing strategy so we can ensure that people are actually adequately housed.
I think you in the article I read, you referred to your approach as the Team Canada approach, right? To do that. And the co-investment, we found that out the hard way about the grants being diminished and just the setup of it. When we look at it, we have a small project, so it's even trickier. But we looked at 14 units. I remember when we had to hire, we worked with Elliston Community Builders who really understand the federal programs well. And they said, look, when they did the pro forma, they said, basically one of your units out of 14 could be market rent could be 80% of market rent. And that's not really why we're trying to, build deeply affordable housing. And little things too is in that get in the way. We're kind of, stepping on our own feet where CMHC had said, well, because we have this small house and a big piece of land, it makes no sense. We can knock it down and serve. But they said, well, if you have 5 units in that house already, we're not going to pay to replace those because, we only pay for what's new. But obviously you can't build around that house. It would make no sense. So it's very, very tricky, especially for smaller nonprofits that are feeling the need to push into social purpose real estate. That being said, I am so, it gives me great hope. And I'm so happy that yourself and the team at CHRA are the voice for the sector and are pushing hard. And I know that, you're making that voice heard time and time again. It will get through. So we do have hope for the future. If people want to find out about the work you're doing at CHRA or get involved, how can they do so?
Well, I would recommend that people check out our website. It's chra-achru.ca. But also, if you're not already a CHRA member or partner organization, I'd highly encourage you to consider becoming either or both as soon as possible. The more support we have from people that are interested in solving the housing crisis, the more we can do to advocate for meaningful change. I would also suggest that you consider joining us in beautiful Winnipeg next month for our annual conference, happening from April 17th to 20th, and details are available on the CHRA website.
Yeah, I will be there. I'm bringing my housing hat, and I'm looking forward to all the wonderful conversations and ideas and things that will flow out of the conference. Is always excellent. So I encourage people, if you haven't already, sign up. CHRA also, as Jake mentioned, there's a mentor program, which is really connecting people who might need that kind of mentorship and people who can like Jake, who have that expertise, who can share it with others. I have been a part of it. It's a great program. And as well, if you're looking for, as a housing professional, how do I change up my credentials or how do I add to it? Check out the Institute of Housing courses there. I am going through the experienced professional route as we speak right now. It's a great course, and it lends. It's one of the, I think, the only real designation in Canada, and it's international designation if you're looking at doing so and you're really vested in the sector. So check that out for more at the website. Jake, always a pleasure talking with you. I look forward to seeing you in Winnipeg, and thank you for all you're doing for this sector.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. I'll come on again anytime you want.
Hey, man, anytime you have something to talk about, different announcements, research, budgets, anything like that, you're a wonderful guest. You're well-spoken, you're fun, so you're always welcome back as we look to create awareness and education around everything: housing, homelessness, health, and employment. Be well.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Talk to you.
Well, there you have it. And I meant what I said. Jacob's a force, and it gives me great hope. He's much younger than I am. He's enthusiastic. He's passionate. He's smart. And so it's great to have voices like his, and he's bringing on others to that table to get in the ear of government to push the agenda of getting more and more affordable housing built across this great nation. I've been on numerous calls with him, and he's listening. Him and the team are listening. And with Ray's leadership at CHRA, great things in the future. As always, a wonderful, informative guest. I learned a lot. I hope you do. I hope you did too. And we'll learn a lot more next time on the way home.